there's too much skill, there's not enough skill, everybody is just this like. So how do you think the players are seeing that from a new form of entertainment perspective?
So I think that this is kind of a testimony of success in some way, is that upon looking at the feedback we've gotten for a lot of this stuff for this tournament in particular, and also for our rules for next year, which a lot of that's incorporated into, we had people complaining about everything. They would praise something and complain about something else. Almost everybody did. Everyone has their own opinions, you know, but there were some people who were super for some things that other people were just like, I'm quitting the sport over this thing. Every single little change, there was, you know, about half the people loved it, half the people did. That is kind of the goal. Obviously, we want more people to like stuff than not.
Yeah, that feels like a little bit of an allegory for life sort of thing there. It's like, if you're making everybody happy, you're probably not doing the right thing. As long as you've got a little bit on both sides, you're probably okay.
It's kind of like a yin and yang type of thing, you know? You need a little bit of stuff to go wrong, you need a little bit of stuff to go right, but, you know, maintain the balance.
All right, Evan Walters, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Can you explain to everybody a little bit about your history and what you do at the World Knife Throwing League and the World Axe Throwing League?
Yeah, so my history, my background is in kind of like marketing, graphic design primarily. So I worked for some Fortune 500s doing that sort of stuff, and kind of in my off time doing kind of social media stuff for fun, and then it kind of developed into where I am now with the World Axe Throwing League and the World Knife Throwing League. And for the World Knife, so I have two titles. They're sister companies, so we do a lot of work for both. But my titles at the moment is I am the commissioner for the World Knife Throwing League and the director of operations for the World Axe Throwing League. And both of them are fairly similar roles, although I do a lot more heavy lifting with the Knife Throwing League than the Axe Throwing League currently.
So for those that don't know, I'm wearing my Waddle merch right now. We worked together for sort of the better part of 3 years and watched the sport evolve a fair bit. Was there a moment for you when you sort of thought, oh, this is a thing now?
Yeah, it was the first ESPN broadcast that we did. I remember, I mean, we weren't even, it's kind of funny I say that because looking back, it still wasn't even much of anything at the time. But I guess that was just kind of the moment where I was like, oh, this is going to be something, you know? But we had only been around for like a year and a half or so, pushing 2 years. And we got signed on with ESPN, and we cobbled together a world championship as quickly as we could, to the best of our ability, which surprisingly did very well in comparison to what we're working with. And we were on ESPN. We had our, on ESPN2, and the fact that I was like sitting in front of the camera and I was thinking to myself, I was like, this is going to go out and a few 100,000 people are going to see this. And obviously you get like the butterflies and stuff, but I was thinking about that. I was like, this is the moment where we're really going to make this thing work. So
yeah, it's definitely come a long way from you deciding you were going to go next door and throw some axes and pick up a part-time job to commentating on ESPN.
Yeah, it was, that's literally just like you said. I was working for the USA Today at the time, and I saw an axe throwing place opened up just a few doors down. And I was like, oh, I'm going to go check that out. That sounds like it'll be fun. Why not? And then they had a part-time job opening, and I was reading, what the benefits were and stuff, and I was like, wow, they get pretty much paid more than I get in overtime. So I might as well just work evenings and weekends, because that sounds like a fun thing to do. I'll be there anyway. And, about less than a year later, I was announced as the commissioner for the World Axe Throwing League, so...
A quick rise to the top.
Yeah. Just happened to be at the right place at the right time, really.
Nice. How's some of the competition been since I left? I think it looks like things have changed a fair bit, and there's some new faces at the top there.
Yeah. It's one of those things. You've been to a few of these tournaments, but for the folks listening at home, it's almost the competition evolves every year slightly, but every year there's a new champion. There's the only folks who have been able to like retain any sort of title is for one of the axe throwing league's disciplines, which is called duels, where a team of 2 people will throw simultaneously at a target. And I think the winners of that have won every year that duels has had a world championship. So it's been 3 years in a row, and that's the only consecutive win that anybody's had for world championships. But the competition is evolving very quickly, especially this year. We have a whole plethora of new, essentially, games that we're going to be doing, because we don't want we had our 2 major ESPN events every year, and that is essentially the same tournament, just one has a world championship title and the other one doesn't. So we wanted to change that up. So this year we have, instead of the U.S. Open, we're done with that, and we have the Pro-Am tournament coming, and that is going to not be a normal tournament. There's going to be a lot of different games, a lot of different disciplines, some experimental stuff. It's going to really test a lot of the abilities of the throwers to stuff they are not accustomed to.
Obviously, there's the fun aspect of having it on ESPN and having something different to broadcast, but how do you think the throwers sort of see it and maybe appreciate it as something different to come in, and it's not just the same? Because I know even when I was there, I know I was responsible for some changes, and then everybody was very up in arms for various reasons, and there's too much skill, there's not enough skill, everybody is just this, like, so how do you think the players are seeing that from a new form of entertainment perspective?
So I think that this is kind of a testimony of success in some way, is that upon looking at the feedback we've gotten for a lot of this stuff for this tournament in particular, and also for our rules for next year, which a lot of that's incorporated into, we had people complaining about everything. So, which does not sound typically like something you want to be like, oh yeah, this is a great success, everyone's complaining. But it was funny because they would praise something and complain about something else. Almost everybody did. Everyone has their own opinions, you know, it totally makes sense. There are some things you like, some things you don't. But it was like that for everything. There were some people who were super for some things that other people were just like, I'm quitting the sport over this thing, and vice versa. And it just, you know, for every single little change, there was, you know, about half the people loved it, half the people didn't. So, and honestly, I think that that's kind of, when we're trying to develop the sport and stuff, that is kind of the goal. Obviously, we want more people to like stuff than not, but if we can find that happy medium, and, you know, also if people just give it a chance, because that's usually the other thing, is they just read this stuff and haven't tried it yet and then complain. But once they actually try it, typically, you know, most people's worries are abated at that point.
Yeah, that feels like a little bit of an allegory for life sort of thing there. It's like if you're making everybody happy, you're probably not doing the right thing, and as long as you've got a little bit on both sides, you're probably okay.
Exactly. You know, it's kind of like a yin and yang type of thing. You know, you need a little bit of stuff to go wrong, you need a little bit of stuff to go right, but, you know, maintain the balance.
I think moving into a little bit more of the community side of things, every sort of hobby has their community. You're a part of a handful of them. The throwing community seems to be quite tight-knit at this point, but you and I know that wasn't necessarily always the case. I know there was and probably is still a little bit of internal competition between some organizations, but what do you think has sort of helped heal some of those wounds that maybe existed at the start of the birth of the sport?
I think a lot of that was really people just trying things out. And experiencing it for themselves on all sides. There's one thing I've pretty much always talked about when I was the commissioner of the World Axe Throwing League, and now as the commissioner of the World Knife Throwing League. I always talk about it as like, I don't care what league you're throwing in, I don't care what organization you're throwing in. As long as you're throwing, then let's throw. You know, let's have fun. And, you know, that's not just like a PR pitch type of thing to try to keep the peace. It's legitimately, I want people just to throw fun stuff. It's, if you're complaining about league, designations and, oh, my league's cooler and this league's worse, and I feel like you're losing sight of what the core value is, and the core value is just to have fun with friends, you know. But luckily, over time, I think people have branched out, and yeah, everyone in general. I think it's a human nature where when something new comes along, it's people are apprehensive, and it's understandable. There are plenty of things I'm probably the same way about, but if you can if you can get through that and not stay like stuck simmering on that negativity and kind of push through, you're going to find a lot more fun things to do, a lot more new experiences. And even if it's not your cup of tea, that's totally okay. At least you have that in your back pocket as a memory of something that you tried, So I think that people branching out to try these new things instead of just sticking with the mentality of, oh, mine's best, I don't need anything else, has been a big thing. But just really just time in general. As time has gone on, people have been more and more willing to, they see that it sticks around, or they see that something sticks around, or this other community is here and it's not going anywhere. So like, okay, well, I guess I'll give it a shot, that kind of thing. So I think and also, and definitely not a thing to forget, is making sure that those communities are open and welcoming to people. And making sure, like, and especially even with your own folks, there are people in communities that I've managed before that would be like, oh, our way is so much better and this, that, and the other. It's like, well, no, I mean, it's just different, and so like being the person to actually step up and speak to them about that and be like, look, let them do their thing, let them have fun, if they want to come and try our thing and have fun with us, that's great too, but kind of moderating your own folks as well to make sure that you have a nice welcoming environment and vice versa, I think goes a long way.
Just one of those let people enjoy the things that they enjoy. You don't have to be in somebody else's Cheerios.
Exactly. Just, as long as you're having fun doing what you're doing, keep doing it.
In regards to sort of the community aspect of things, again, one thing I hear from people pretty consistently, and I know certainly resonates with me a little bit, is just sort of how hard it is to make friends as an adult. And how have you sort of seen that play out in your life, and how does the involvement in a hobby in a community like axe throwing sort of mitigate some of that?
In terms of making friends as an adult, and like you mentioned, with it's community building, and axe throwing, or really any other type of hobby that you find, it's a way to, even if you wouldn't normally connect with somebody in your day-to-day life, you have something to connect each other with. If it's axe throwing, I can go to so many axe or knife throwing venues and stuff now, and even if this is somebody who I may not invite over to Thanksgiving dinner or something like that necessarily, but this is someone where they and I can connect from something. And that's really all it takes, is you can start building a bridge once you have a connection, and having a community that people can see visibly. That's actually one of the reasons why leagues are so important. But having leagues is so important because it shows people that community. It lets them experience that, because obviously with the World Knife Throwing League or the World Axe Throwing League, there are tons of people I can connect to online to talk about this stuff all the time. But it's not until I get into a venue and see this group of people participating with each other. And, and another thing to keep in mind with that, too, is that it's a smaller part of a whole. Everyone has their own community that is part of a bigger community. So I can go... I have, like, there's a local league here I can go to, and I can connect with those folks. But then when I go to a larger tournament, some of us might go to that tournament, and then we are instantly connected to a bigger community, even more so than we had before. And so making that initial connection with somebody in a mutual hobby or mutual interest is essentially kind of like the key to unlocking the door of being able to have a plethora of new friends. And I think a lot of people have this sort of definition. Everyone has their own definition of what like friendship constitutes. There are some people I consider kind of like lifelong friends, but I only talk to them maybe once every 2 months or so, randomly. But it's one of those. They're some of those people I know I can just call and be like, hey, let's chat, let's update and see what happens, and they're always happy to do it. If I needed them to drop something and come rescue me from somewhere, they would do it, even though we haven't spoken in 2 months. But then there are other friends that you see and talk to every day, and those people might not be in the same type of thing. They may not be willing to drop everything to come and rescue you from something you did. But it's so really making friends as an adult, I think, is kind of also a bit of like setting your own expectations, because not every single person you meet is going to be your best friend, and but you might be surprised. I think the key is just being open to it.
Yeah, and I think it would probably be a fair statement to say you'd be more surprised than you think with who you might be friends with through a mutual connection somewhere. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things where even just looking at the axe throwing community, I don't know if you could pick a more eclectic group of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are people from so many different walks of life, particularly in axe and knife throwing. You'll get folks who are really into like the bushcraft and like the outdoors stuff, and then you'll get folks who are like super into the kind of the hipster, urban tattoo shop vibe, and then you'll get like church groups. It's like all sorts of different demographics from all over the place all come together to enjoy this one mutual thing, and that's one of the really cool things about, particularly the axe and knife throwing leagues themselves. But there are lots of different communities out there that are like that. But it's very cool to see that within the World Axe Throwing League and the World Knife Throwing League for sure.
You're pretty confident talking in front of audiences now. You talked about, obviously, being on the ESPN streams. Obviously, there's always a little bit of butterflies with that. But you've been on ESPN broadcasts for 3 or 4 years. No, it'll be 5 years now, right? Because 2018 was the U.S. Open.
Yeah, 5 years.
Anyways, and you've got a Twitch stream that's slowly gathering a little bit of a loyal following there. Mm-hmm. Have you sort of always felt comfortable being in that sort of setting, or did it take you a while to work into that?
I guess it kind of depends. I guess I like thinking about it. I think I have been fairly comfortable in the setting. I never really had much of an issue with it, probably up until like teenage years, and then I struggled with it a little bit for a while. But then I started doing some theater in like middle school, high school, and even still, that didn't really. I wouldn't necessarily say that helped. Like I got up in front of people and all that stuff, but at the time I was also being homeschooled, so I kind of like started regressing a little bit in terms of like extroverted nature. But I would say that what really kind of made me come out on my show was going to college, especially right after being homeschooled for so many years. It's like, whoa, everybody's here, and everybody's doing stuff. I think that kind of got me into it a little bit, and I started doing. I joined a music fraternity because all my friends were in the music fraternity, and so I started learning how to sing. And so I did a bunch of performances with like there's a local symphony that we did some performances with, and things like that. And so I kind of got back into it. But outside of that, I had not really been much of the limelight. All my hobbies are pretty much introverted. Like, I'll just sit there and play video games for a full weekend straight and not see a single other person and be perfectly happy with that. But being in front of folks, I don't really think about it. I guess it's kind of it, which I guess is a kind of a talent in itself in some ways. I found that was the easiest thing. My first ESPN broadcast, I was nervous. Like, I was just trying to not think about, a few 100,000 people are seeing this. No big deal, right? But as time has gone on, I just don't think about it. I'm just more focused on the conversation I'm having with somebody. Whether it's on the Twitch stream and people are chatting in there, I'm just talking to them like I would just talk to you right now. Or, depending on how many people listen to this, I'm just, doesn't really bother me. I'm just talking to you, so.
That's fair enough. Tell me a little bit about your homeschooling. I didn't know you were homeschooled, and it's something that I'm thinking more and more about.
Yeah, so I was I moved around a few times growing up, and so I went to public school through like 3rd, 4th grade, and then went to a small private school that it was very small, like between grades K through 8, we had like 145 students total. Like, my classroom was like, I think 10 people. Very, very small class sizes, combined grades in classes, which was interesting. It was definitely a different experience, but then we moved fairly far, about an hour away, so we couldn't really justify my folks taking me to that school all the time in middle school. So since we left halfway through the year, we had to make up that year or basically get held back. And so my folks were like, well, why don't we just try homeschooling for the year and for the rest of the year and see what happens. So I'm not. It's different for every state in the U.S. I'm not sure how it is in Canada, but in Virginia, where I'm located and grew up, you can either do one of two options for homeschooling. You can do just being taught by like your parents or someone else and take your GED test. Or just periodic tests every year to make sure that you're like learning enough, or you can get a state-approved curriculum, and the Virginia Education Board has like a list of approved curriculums that you can do, and basically they're kind of like freelance schools almost. They'll usually have some folks at the time. This was kind of before the internet was super big. I was like I think I was the first graduating high school class online. But my siblings didn't want to do the online stuff. They weren't super computer savvy. So they just got the books and would do the work from the books and send it literally through the mail out to California, where the headquarters was for our school. It's probably a lot more efficient these days, especially with the internet. But it was, my folks, we did it for about a year, to finish up that year, and they really liked it. I was not so much a fan because of the lack of social life. But looking back on it now, I'm not super upset about it, because I learned a lot, and it also gave me a lot more opportunities outside of school to do stuff. I used to compete in martial arts, so I traveled up and down the East Coast a bit doing that at the time. I had a job. I worked at a local comic and game shop. And I probably would not have been able to do all those things. And also we traveled a good bit too, like overseas and stuff. And we were able to work on our schoolwork on these trips if we needed to. So there's definitely some ups and downs with the homeschooling. Overall, I would say I had more good experiences than bad. Most of the bad comes from just being cooped up in the house as a teenager with your family for literal years.
That's a fair statement, I guess. So you mentioned your role at the WATL is listed as the director of operations. It's not a role you would necessarily consider overly creative, and you went to school for graphic design and UX design. So talk to me a little bit about how having a creative mind has helped you in a job that maybe necessarily you wouldn't have expected it to.
So I think one of the benefits of kind of going from a creative space to traditionally a less creative space, I suppose, is the hard part is kind of being on lower levels of that, to be honest, and kind of working your way up through it, because you have a lot less freedom to do stuff. I was lucky that I got in fairly early. I was the first full-time employee for WATL, the World Axe Throwing League. And so I had, obviously I had to run everything past the boss. But I was given a lot of freedom to really do a lot with it. And that was really kind of what fueled the early years. But as time has gone on, it's because there isn't, the development has slowed. Because there are thousands of competitors now. There are hundreds of venues across the world that are members, and there's a lot of upkeep that has to go with those. There is still room for innovation. There always will be, but in comparison to the massive amounts that there were in the early days, it's not quite as much. So you kind of have to find other outlets for that creativity. One of the things that helped out a lot is being a little more hands-on with like social media and community elements. Being able to host online social programs, maybe like International Axe Throwing Day, coming up with something that can get people engaged and is fun to do. That sort of thing is always a treat. For the World Axe Throwing League and being the director of operations, mostly what I do for that now is just kind of make sure that all the wheels are turning correctly and that there's no big major hiccups. And other than that, it's the staff that does a lot of kind of just the upkeep. And that's another reason why I was moved to be the commissioner of the World Knife Throwing League, because we basically started from scratch with it, just like I had started from scratch with the World Knife Throwing League. So I still get a lot of that creativity I'm allowed to do, which I enjoy. Especially, I get to do a lot of TikToks and stuff, which is just dumb fun. So,
going down the rabbit hole on creativity for a minute, you're working on building a bit of a brand around painting hobby miniatures. We talked a little bit before we started about you entering a couple competitions and winning some stuff. Do you have anything around your desk that you're particularly proud of?
Yeah, I started, I've been miniature painting since I was little. It's always been kind of like my hobby. But I ended up kind of taking a break after, during college and after, to focus on studies. But this right here has been the thing that I've put kind of the most competitive work into at the moment. Not sure if I can get a good screen on here or not. Let me change this lighting up a little bit. Maybe. Actually, nice. Let's get this reflected a little bit. There we go. That's a little better. But yeah, it's a fantasy thing. There's an orc matriarch riding a feathered T-Rex. It's just a miniature kit that I bought and painted. I don't think that you're going to be able to see too much detail in there, but this was clocked in at about 90 hours worth of work. So,
it looks
just a little bit of time. Yeah. Thank you. But I took that out, as well as a few other things. It's actually funny because that's not the thing that won, even though that was like my competition piece that I was working really hard on. I did get an honorable mention for that, which is honestly what I was aiming for it. This was my first competition I'd ever done formally. And so I was just hoping for an honorable mention for that, and I got it. So I consider that a success. I hit the target I was looking for. What I was surprised at, thank you. What I was surprised at was actually, this isn't the full unit, but this is a unit of guys that there's essentially like a regiment category.
Yeah.
And, it's not going to focus up here, but that's okay. But there's this unit of guys, basically there are about 8 more of them. And that won first place in the unit category for the miniature painting competition, which I brought just because I had them. I did not paint them with the intent on entering them into anything ever, but it just happened to be at the right place at the right time, I think. So,
How important is it, do you think, for everybody to at least have some sort of creative outlet?
I'm clearly biased, I feel, but I think it's very important. And, it's another thing of what some people would define creativity differently than others. But I think it is important that everybody has a creative outlet. It doesn't necessarily have to be painting or drawing or theater or photography, or it doesn't have to be an artistic creative outlet necessarily. But I think it's kind of an inherent thing with most human beings, maybe not all, but I feel like most need some sort of creativity, something to do. I feel like, especially during kind of like 2020 and the pandemic when the lockdowns were happening, we saw a lot of people kind of going like stir crazy a little bit, getting a little cabin fever. I was the opposite. I was in like total bliss. Like I was like, great, I can just paint for hours and hours and hours, and I can just play video games and like, but even still, the thing that was really cool is you saw so many people doing these really neat creative things despite that restriction, and I think we actually saw a big boost in creativity in what a lot of people were doing because there were less outdoor things that they regularly did, like, going and hanging out at a bar, which is not, there's not anything inherently bad about doing that necessarily, but, they were spending that time in other ways to be more creative, to keep themselves entertained and to enjoy life a little bit. I think that's kind of what it boils down to is, being a little bit creative helps you create ways to enjoy life a little more.
Yeah, and I think touching on what you talked about in terms of having a little bit of restriction, bringing out more creativity, I find myself, and one thing that I've heard from other people as well, is that when you put some artistic restrictions on yourself, it can often lead to sort of a better outcome, whether it's a time restriction or a place restriction, or just everybody wants to think outside the box, but sometimes if putting yourself in the box is actually where the biggest leaps in creativity come from.
Absolutely. That's actually one of kind of the founding principles of graphic design is kind of being able to be creative despite restrictions in what you're designing. And kind of the same thing, I often think of the kind of the parallel between, and I know that this may be a controversial opinion, but between the original Star Wars trilogy and the episodes 1 through 3 that came out in the 90s and early thousands, there was a definite shift in those two trilogies of, kind of what was going on, the graphics, because essentially, if you take a look, especially a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff, because I'm a big nerd, is that there were a lot of restrictions on the very first Star Wars movie. He had a very tight budget. There were so many things that he wanted to do that he couldn't. If you take a look at a lot of the original concept art for Star Wars, there is so much more that he would have done, and I'm not necessarily sure it would have been good. So I think a lot of that restriction helped a bit. And that's not to say that restriction is always going to help creativity flourish, but everything in moderation,
Talking about restriction to creativity in a slightly different way, you've had a couple of TikToks go viral, pretty viral for at least the niche you're in, for sure.
No.
Is it weird that you can record a 15-second video and it can be seen by hundreds of thousands of people with no recourse?
Yeah, a little bit. Like, because you see the numbers go up, on these videos and stuff. And you see people commenting, and eventually stuff happens where, like, you'll see local people commenting. They're like, oh, I know where this is. And I'm like, who are you? But then, you think that, especially, like, if you get a video that hits, like, 1 or 2 million or something, you're like, heck yeah, I'm starting to pop off. There's gonna be a thing. It's not, it's like every little thing. There are people who probably go viral 15 to 20 times before anyone even recognizes who they are, kind of thing, or goes viral. but it is weird because there's like the one point it's almost like I don't know what to call it. I always just call it like fluff. It's just fluff. It's a neat little tidbit. It's oh yeah, I had 2 million people saw my stupid 15-second video I recorded. But that means literally nothing. I still have to go to my job. I still have to, walk the dog. I'm not going out there and buying mansions and stuff because of a little video. So it's weird because it's like this weird amount of like, hey, people like this. I'm funny. People like what I'm doing. This is great. But on the other hand, it literally doesn't change anything. So it's kind of a weird duality of like, am I? I started kind of questioning. It's like, am I actually funny, or just one thing just happened to be it? It's like, especially when you like post the next video and it gets like 100 views, and it's like, oh well, shit. Yeah, I guess I'm not that funny. But it's one of those things where especially after having like the big viral video that I had go, it had literally nothing to do with anything except for just something I thought was funny, and it was after having that happen, I had like a conversation in my own head. It was like, oh, should I like change my social media platform to focus on this, or should I keep doing what I want to do, or this, that, and the other? And in the end, I think what I landed on and what kind of keeps me a bit grounded, I suppose, in terms of that is, one, I barely get any of the views I used to, so that keeps me pretty grounded. But the other thing is to not worry about it. Is basically just as long as I think it's funny, or as long as I am enjoying what I'm doing, then I'm gonna keep doing it. And if other people do too, then I'm glad they're there for the ride. But if not, then that's cool too.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely resonates with me. I've tried this a couple different ways now, and I think it's one of those things where if you're not doing something for yourself first and you're trying to force something too hard, you're gonna end up burning out, or worse, hating yourself for it, or something like that.
Absolutely. It's again, like I mentioned, it's kind of setting expectations. If you like, obviously I think I'm a pretty funny guy. I think I'm a pretty likable guy.
I'll agree.
In some facet or form. Appreciate it. But that doesn't mean everybody's going to. Not everyone's going to get my humor. I definitely know that. A lot of it's very niche. But that's okay, as long as I do, and as long as the people can connect with it, then that's great. If I try to set an expectation of, well, everyone's got to think this is funny, or everyone's going to want to do this, or, if I set expectations like that, the burnout will come so quickly, because you'll just see that you'll see that there's just not the traction you expect.
So we've talked about this a little bit, and you mentioned it as well, but I also have this weird dichotomy of really sort of hating social media for everything that it does and everything that it is, and all of that, but also realizing that it's this ultra powerful tool to reaching millions of people. And there's really never been an easier time in the history of the world to build a brand. So what is your relationship with that sort of love-hate aspect?
Man, you hit it so well. it is definitely a love-hate relationship. I think, and it's kind of the internet as a whole. Obviously, kind of our generation was the first one that kind of grew up with the internet. And I'm leaning into the elder millennial cycle. So like, I didn't really start doing internet stuff until, probably like 13 or so, with the old Flash games and videos and stuff and things like that, before YouTube and even before MySpace and all that. But like, I remember kind of the shift of things, and thinking back on it, you have like Facebook that started coming out in like 2007, 2008 when it started getting popular, and that's when kind of social media was born. Before that, you had like online forums and stuff, but it was fairly anonymous. And nowadays, like you mentioned, it is so so easy to build a brand. It's easy to build a narrative about either yourself or someone else or something else. And there's not only a love-hate relationship, but it's a double-edged sword, I think, in terms of like the internet, but particularly social media, is that there has never been a way to communicate with people quicker and with more people. It's amazing because you can get your stuff out there if you really work at it. Obviously it takes time. You can't just make one post and everything's going to go off. Usually, unless you just hit a particular thing. That doesn't typically happen. But with consistent work, you can make that kind of happen. But then kind of the downside of that is it could get into like people who don't really deserve that. There are people who have platforms that probably should not have platforms. It was earlier in its history, less so now, but it is still applicable now. It is kind of the Wild West in terms of like information. I would say overall there's more good than bad that has to do with social media and the internet as a whole. But the bad sucks so much. It sometimes doesn't feel like there is more good than bad. But I would say overall, when I sit down and think about it, there is usually more good than bad. I think kind of the issue and really where a lot of the bad comes in is a lot to do with people's personal responsibility. We, again, like you and I kind of grew up in the generation with the internet. We were told by our parents and stuff to, not make friends with strangers, not, now we'll just like literally use the internet to order some stranger to come take us home. It's like, it's definitely, it's changed a lot. And people are not, I think that the main issue is people don't keep up with it. There are a lot of people who just use it as their own personal talking piece that thinks that's anonymous, and they don't think about who's on the receiving end of that. They don't recognize that there are people at the other end. They'll even... I can't think of anything in particular, thankfully, anymore. But I remember, especially in the early days of some of the social media stuff I did, my face was kind of out there for a bit. Still kind of is. And I've been better about learning how to manage what goes out and what doesn't, and what I'm okay with people seeing and what I'm not okay with them seeing, kind of thing. I think that that's a really valuable skill that people should learn when using social media, but also they should learn the opposite of not just people seeing them, but what they see from people. There are going to be 10 idiots saying something stupid that is without thought to every one person saying something genuine and good, which sucks, but keep making sure that you keep more in mind of the genuineness is kind of a real big key for making sure that the love-hate relationship stays mainly love and not hate.
I think for a lot of guys our age, we sort of grew up in what we now know as basically the birth of video games as we know it. And there's this sort of swirling narrative that I've found myself a part of in the last, I don't know, call it a year or so, of sort of cheap dopamine, to which video games are probably a pretty significant contributor. How do you balance some of the nerdier aspects of your life with work, friends, a relationship, family? I know it was a big change for me a couple of years back, going from basically having no responsibilities to needing to be involved in somebody else's life. So
it's interesting. There's it kind of especially kind of coming from a lot of nerdy kind of communities and things. I've seen some people kind of go down the rabbit hole of not being able to, I guess of not being able to moderate. And I think that kind of is the overall thing. It's just everything in moderation is kind of the key takeaway of what I'm going to talk about a little bit. I specifically remember a slightly edited memory now, but basically I was talking with a friend of mine. We had played World of Warcraft a bit. He was a senior in school, in university, and I was a freshman. He was older than me. And, I'd been hanging out with him a lot, a ton, even before I went to school, but we ended up going to the same university. He was on the way out, I was on the way in. And there was one night where we were just kind of walking and talking after, I think it was like Anime Club or something. And we just got on the conversation of like relationships and stuff. And he admitted to me that he had never even been kissed before. And it kind of like, it kind of hit me a little bit. And I was like, huh. I mean, I had, obviously, at that point, but I wasn't that far off. And I was like, if I don't moderate, if I basically just like only focus on like these hobbies that I love and nothing else, I'm gonna go down that route, and I don't want that, So I basically just figured out a way to kind of moderate that. Like I would, kind of not necessarily set a hard schedule, but be like, hey, I have this evening off. I can do the thing that I want to do. I can do my nerdy fun thing. But then just make sure that I make time for other stuff too. Even if I don't necessarily want to, more often than not, I would say that I'm happy I did it. But usually, I always have that kind of like fighting thing in the back of my head. It's like, hey, work on your hobbies. Like, do the stuff you want to do. Like, play a video game or, paint something or, just watch a bunch of YouTube mysteries, like documentaries for 6 hours that have nothing to do with anything relevant in your life. But I don't do that, all the time. There's a time and a place. And sometimes, every once in a while there's a weekend where I'll be like, okay, I don't have anything to do on this day. I'm just going to make sure I keep that day open and clear it and just, like, do the nerd thing. Like, I think there was one, like, a year or so ago. I'd been working a bunch and I was getting kind of bogged down. I was like, I need a day just to, like, disconnect from the world for a bit. And so I fired up one of my favorite games and I woke up, I slept in, woke up, took a shower, got some food, sat down on the computer, and did not do anything else except for, eat, essentially, until the end of the day. And that is a luxury, and I recognize that. But because that is that should be a luxury, I guess is actually a better way to put that. That should be a luxury. That should not be, if you want to kind of be successful at multiple things, that should only be a luxury. Basically, you should be able to moderate something like that. Whereas as a kid, obviously I would do that all the time, and it would be super fun. And that day was particularly fun, but I don't need to do that all the time. And I think that's the there are other ways to get that cheap dopamine. Trying something new every once in a while, going out, even if it's just like asking somebody, if it's like, hey, you want to go grab dinner with me? I'm just going to go and hang out. It'll be nice to have some company. If it's for a friend, if it's, a significant other, a family member, something like that, that's always helpful. There was a while there when things started opening back up from the pandemic where, like, every once in a while I would just reach out to my dad and be like, hey, do you want to get dinner? And he'd be like, yeah, sure, let's do it. So, little things like that are really helpful. But I would say, even though I've been harping on moderating the fun stuff, that doesn't mean don't have any. Like, definitely make sure to moderate the outside, like the things that are not hobbies also. But it's a constant work. It's a constant balance thing. If I didn't put work into it, I could definitely fall back into just, painting a miniature for hours and hours and hours and disconnecting from reality. I'd love to, fairly frequently, but so it'd be really easy to do. But just keeping in mind that it should be an occasional thing, and that there are other important things going on too, that are just bigger than my wants necessarily. So, long story short.
What did being in a fraternity teach you about yourself that you don't think you would have learned otherwise?
It really jump-started, and to preface a little bit, obviously we all know that there are some very unfortunate stereotypes about fraternities, and that some stereotypes do exist for a reason. But thankfully, I joined a fairly nerdy fraternity, and specifically one that was like a dry chapter of the fraternity, so specifically did not involve alcohol in anything, so it was, if that kind of gives you any sort of idea, I would say aside from that, it was fairly standard in terms of fraternity experiences. Lots of guys doing some dumb stuff here and there, but having a lot of fun, and the camaraderie and stuff you get. But I would say that really helped jumpstart getting reacclimated to social life again, for one. Because again, I had gone from homeschooling to college, and a lot of those guys just kind of took me in, and it was like we mentioned earlier, where if you have that, even though all those guys, I don't talk to all of them anymore, I still talk to plenty of them on a daily basis, from over a decade ago. But those guys, I may not have connected with outside of the fraternity much, and it's not something, I wouldn't hang out with every single person there all the time, but we had that small connection, and I still consider them friends, even though we may not have hung out and played video games together or something like that. That's okay. We still had that bond, and I can go back to that with them if I wanted to. Just like for the axe throwing or something, there'll be someone from a league I haven't talked to in forever and be like, "Hey, you remember that tournament we went to?" It's like, yeah, that little connector, kind of helps out a lot. But the other big thing I would say that the fraternity helped me out with a lot, was, I would say, kind of a leadership thing. A bit of that. I ended up going to some of their national conventions that they had while I was an undergrad, and they were called Leadership Institutes. And it was, a lot of seminars about how to be successful and all that stuff from people you'd never heard of who were probably successful, you think. But there ended up being a lot of good advice there. It was, you'd had to kind of find and pick and choose, but eventually I brought a lot of that back to the fraternity, and it let me experiment before getting out into the world as like an adult with taking on leadership positions, and also like just kind of working towards something I wanted to work towards. For example, there was one thing, we were really, when I was joining the fraternity, we did a fundraiser, and it was like a chili thing, where we cooked a big batch of chili and we sold it for $2 a bowl to fundraise, so we could basically pay our dues and like get fun little fraternity trinkets and stuff to give to our big brothers and all that stuff. This is before I had even gotten in. We did this as like a pledge class, basically. And it ended up being really successful. We asked, I think we asked Walmart if they would donate something, and they gave us a $75 gift card, which pretty much paid everything. And we ended up making almost $200 off of chili. So we basically just netted $200 out of, by putting in a few days worth of work, and we were able to cover everybody's entrance dues and all that stuff, which was really cool. But at the same time, when I went to the Leadership Institute, one of the guys was talking about how basically being more efficient. And so one of the things he mentioned was like, how many of you all run fundraisers? And most everybody raised their hands. It's like, okay, what's the most successful fundraiser you raised? And so that one for us was the most successful one. We had about 10 guys. We raised $200. We probably we had at least 2 people manning the chili station for 4 hours a day for about a week. So that's a lot of time. That's a lot of manpower for, $200. And so he was like, what if you all just worked minimum wage at a job for that same amount of time? How much money would you have? And when he did the math, it was like, oh, well, we would probably have like $1,000 at least. He's like, well, why don't you just donate that to the fraternity instead? It was like when you started, and that was one of the key memories for the fraternity for me, was like, holy crap, that's so much more efficient. Why don't we just add that little extra bit? Like, if every single person in our chapter of the fraternity worked an extra hour a semester at their job and just donated that to the fraternity, we would have like enough money that we could run a full-on fun event, instead of working our asses off to scrape together chili or sandwiches for people or something and hopefully make a few $100 yeah, after we put days of work with dozens of guys doing the work for it. It's like, when you put it into that perspective, it that kind of just changed my whole philosophy on like what work is, and like how basically working kind of like smarter, not harder, and leading people to come to those same conclusions, I guess. So that was probably the biggest takeaway I got from being in a fraternity is working smarter.
Talking about leadership in a slightly different but similar way, something else that I've been thinking on recently is a little bit of lack of effective male role models, which has sort of led me a little bit in part to what I'm doing now with this project. But sort of the almost destruction of the nuclear family, whether there's like less male teachers or community leaders, or the awesome uncle that you had as a kid, or even sort of a little bit of the demonization of guys in general right now. Talk to me about how your brothers sort of helped you from that aspect as well.
Yeah, so that's actually that's a great point to be in on. It's interesting too. I was just talking the other day that more often than not, I would say like in a lot of my friends and like throughout most of my life, I would have like a few best friends who were guys, but then all the rest like less more like not best friends typically, but more friends were women than men, more fairly frequently throughout my life until I got into the fraternity. And then throughout my college life, all my best friends were just this giant group of like 30 other guys. And so it was kind of a big shift for me. And, they're all very, very different. So there are some who I grew to really admire and respect. And, there are also faculty as well that were in that. And then there are some where I was like, okay, well, this is just another, this is another guy, But I think the key thing to remember, especially when it comes to like guys and role models, is with being, well, it's kind of hard to say as a guy myself, I suppose it's we're probably looking for something different. I think what I would say is like, with every single guy that I was in with a fraternity, there were good parts and there were bad parts. I mean, not necessarily bad. There were parts I may not have agreed with, or there are parts that I did agree with in some people's philosophies, or not. Luckily, not. I didn't disagree with many of the actions because we're a fairly clean cut crew. But there. I think it's still important to really not idealize too much. Everybody is human, regardless, and no one's going to be the perfect role model, but there will be people that do things that are worthy of being a role model. It's kind of the same thing, even in terms of like fantasy elements, like Superman, or in any sort of like fictional story, or like Lord of the Rings or something. There are lots of guys that you can look to in terms of fictional or real, but you have to keep in mind they're people. They are not infallible. I think a lot of people, when they look for role models, they look for someone who is basically infallible. And again, it's the exact same thing of setting expectations. If you expect that someone is going to be infallible and they turn out not to be, that's world shattering. And you shouldn't set yourself up for that. One person I like to point to as probably, at least on a public facing way, as borderline infallible would be like Mr. Rogers. Doesn't necessarily mean he was. I'm sure that there's stuff that, and probably he'd be one of the first ones to admit it. He's not been a perfect person forever or anything like that. But what we've seen throughout, well, what most people would probably agree with, at least, especially in hindsight now with Mr. Rogers, is everything that we've seen, lots of amazing values, lots of good, wholesome lessons to be learned from this man, who did not only, sort of preach these things, but lived a lot of them. But he was still a person, he wasn't this, ethereal being of infallibility. So what I would say to anybody who's looking for male role models or anything like that in particular is find elements of people that are worthy of being followed. And never, never, ever follow anyone's advice who says they have all the answers, because no one does. I always feel like the people who are the most sure of themselves are usually the most wrong. And I say that because I'm unsure of that.
I think that's a pretty fair statement, man. I also feel like that's a pretty good place to wrap things up. It's an awesome insight, and I think the call out to Mr. Rogers is one that we can all hope to aspire to, right? So if people wanted to connect with you or check out your stuff, where should they go?
A lot of the goings on these days seems to be with the World Knife Throwing League professionally. If you really want to get into the nerdy stuff, you can find all the social medias as Walter's Workshop, all one word. Otherwise, check out the World Knife Throwing League and the World Axe Throwing League social medias and on ESPN. And those will be the places where you can find me.
Perfect, man. Thanks for being on the show. I appreciate it.